tRPC is a great framework for creating type-safe APIs, and it works really well when you have a setup like we do with a monorepo, where you control both the backend and the frontend. It will need an adapter for whichever framework it's running on top of, which in our case is Koa. And those adapters are quite simple, so you can write them yourself. I've done so in the past, but luckily somebody has made one for us that we're going to use. So let's install the tRPC server component and the Koa adapter. I will go into the backend folder and install tRPC/server and tRPC-koa-adapter. And now that that is installed, let's try and attach it in our backend. So we go to this index here and we'll create Koa middleware from the adapter. Let me turn off Copilot again. And init tRPC from tRPC server. So these are the two things that we need. So after our routes here from the regular REST router, we will install the tRPC adapter. And let me just paste this from my article here. But basically, we create an instance of the tRPC framework and then a router. And this router that we're creating right now will just have one procedure. And we'll get back to what procedures and queries and mutations are in a little bit. But for now, we can just say that we have a query called ping, and it will respond with pong. And we then create the middleware using that adapter. So this creates a Koa middleware using our tRPC router. And we then, in our Koa app, use this adapter. So this should set up tRPC. Let's try and run it and see if we can connect to it. I'm in my backend folder here. So it says server is listening, so at least it's working. Let me create another terminal and see what happens if I try and call this ping endpoint. And you can see I get this JSON out that says result data pong. So that is how tRPC wraps things, and we'll get a little bit into that as well. But at least we can see here that the server seems to be working. And you can also see that the logger logs this endpoint just fine, because the logger is a middleware that is installed before the tRPC and middleware. So that goes through that just as everything else. Before we move on to creating more advanced endpoints, let's just restructure things a little bit. I'm going to go by the conventions as they're specified in the docs by creating a tRPC folder in the backend source folder and creating a file called trpc.ts in there. Let's start by creating this folder. So in here, we're going to be initializing the tRPC instance instead of out in the index file. And so this is just copied from the docs. This is a sort of semi-standard. One thing I want to note here, besides from us creating this instance here, we're exporting some things. And one of the things to note here is that we're exporting t.procedure as public procedure. So in a normal setup, we would obviously be introducing authentication, and for any endpoint that is only allowed for people who are logged in, we would create something called protected procedure or private procedure or something to that effect. Maybe even an admin procedure if you have different roles and so on. In this course, however, everything's going to be accessible to everybody, so we're not going to be doing that. But that's just to note why this is called as it is. And that is the thing that we're going to be using for our router. Let me create a file called app router, which is also a sort of semi-standard. And we'll move things from our index here. So this is the router that we're creating right now. It's called tRPC router, but we'll change the name here. And so instead of this, we will import the router that we have locally. And instead of procedure, we'll change this to public procedure and import that as well from locally. Finally, we'll export this. And then we will change, we can now get rid of this initialization here and change this and import that from there. Get rid of this one as well. And then let's add another endpoint to this. So I'm just going to copy something here and paste it in here. So getServiceTypes is a public procedure as well, and it returns an array of objects, which each have an ID that's a number and a name that's a string. And I want to stress here that I'm not specifying types for neither input nor output. And what that means is that tRPC is going to rely on TypeScript to infer the types. And that works perfectly well. So this getServiceTypes endpoint is typed so that it returns an array of objects that have an ID, which is a number, and a name, which is a string. So you do have type safety without being explicit about it, but it does help to be explicit. I personally have a rule that I'm allowed to use inference if a function is sitting within the same file as where it's being called. So utility functions and things like that. But if I'm creating anything that resembles a public API, even if it's just something that's going to be used in other places in the same app, I will be explicit about return types and input types. And there's a linter rule that enforces that. You can go and install in your project, but we're not going to be doing that in this project, but just to mention that it does exist. But this now creates a temporary first endpoint for our service types. The last thing I need to do in here is to export the type of the app router. And you'll see when we get to building the front end, you'll be seeing why this is necessary. So for now, I'll just use this. So this specifies that the app router, which is with a capital A, is going to be the type of the app router, and that we will be able to access from the front end.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.